I was conducting an ethnographic interview in the Plaza Hotel. And we were trying to figure out what really motivated them and what was it about staying in a luxury hotel that made it worth it. The Plaza was a good example. So I'm sitting there doing this interview with someone, and we're sitting in a little cafe. We're having a good interview. A colleague and mine, we're talking to this person and we're asking questions about why she likes to stay there and what really motivates her and so on. And then something really interesting happened. I was taking notes with a pen, and my pen either jammed or ran out of ink. I don't know what happened. And someone from the Plaza, it might have been our server, it might have just been someone else, came over and placed a Plaza pen right next to me and walked away. And the person who we were talking to said, when I talk about luxury in a luxury hotel, and I think about the Plaza, that's what I mean.
Welcome to Any Insights Yet? The podcast that explores the intersection of strategy, inspiration, and branding. I'm Chris Kocek. In today's episode, we're unpacking the beautiful messiness of ethnography with Bob Morais, business anthropologist and lecturer at Columbia University's Business School. Bob's work has helped shape a wide variety of brands, including Sensodyne, Freshpet, Simply Orange, WD-40, among many others. During our conversation, Bob shares some of the most effective techniques he's used to help brands reposition themselves and come up with new product innovations. Bob also shares some of his favorite AI experiments to help with ethnographic research, and he explains why he thinks it'll still be a while before AI can do what great ethnographers do in real-world research situations. Before we get to all that, though, let's begin by exploring the critical difference between a finding and an insight.
A finding is basically a discovery about consumer attitudes, behavior, sentiments, even the cultural influences that shape them. An insight is very different. It's a deeper understanding and an interpretation of a finding that has marketing implications. An insight, a good insight, can elevate a brand in the marketplace. But a truly novel insight can help a brand soar and really separate itself from the rest of the flock and win.
Absolutely. It reminds me of like the Red Bull line, Red Bull gives you wings.
Yeah.
An insight really gives you wings. So with a finding, I often call them like a boring or tired human truth. Can you think of an example of a tired human truth or a flat-footed finding that did not do much for you?
Oh, sure. A number of years ago, I was working in the sensitive toothpaste category on a brand called Sensodyne. Now, Sensodyne is pretty good at alleviating pain from sensitive teeth. It's not the greatest analgesic. It's not like taking aspirin or ibuprofen or Tylenol. It can take, 1 to 2 weeks to work. And the brand wasn't doing much in the marketplace. It was dental professionals that would recommend a brand like Sensodyne. So the basic finding that you get when you do focus groups or any kind of interviews really is that people with sensitive teeth feel pain when they eat cold ice cream, drink hot coffee, and they also will feel pain when they put pressure on their teeth when they brush. So you push that a little bit further and you say, so what happens when you feel that pain when you brush? And they say, well, I really avoid brushing that area. So that's a pretty good finding. Maybe there's something you could do with it, but it's not necessarily going to provide that much lift. And so what our team did is think really hard about the implications of avoiding the area of the mouth or the teeth and the gums where you should be brushing. But the campaign was based on a strategy that we called the serial consequences strategy, as in one thing led to another. So we needed to communicate that Sensodyne stopped the pain, and then to say, if you have pain, you stop brushing a certain area, and that can lead to all kinds of problems, a kind of chain reaction, plaque buildup, gingivitis, periodontal disease. You could even lose a tooth. So we had this idea, and we called it the domino effect. And it was literally a visual of dominoes falling over and tumbling into a category where there was a missing tooth. And it was extremely effective. And so the selling idea was that Sensodyne stops the pain, because you need to do that, and stops the domino effect. So that phrase and that advertising tested really well against just advertising that's addressed pain. And it really helped Sensodyne dominate the marketplace in sensitivity toothpastes. So it's a really good example of taking a basic finding, you avoid brushing, and thinking about it and saying, what are the implications of this? And ultimately, how could I apply it to marketing and advertising and so on? And it was extremely effective.
When we were talking the other day, you said a lot of times the data sources won't give you the why or the stories you need to really open things up.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that? Or do you have an example that comes to mind?
I do. So let's say you're talking to smokers about a smoker's mouthwash. It's hard to get people to talk about smoking when they're smokers in a focus group because they all feel that you're judging them. All the people in the back room are judging them. Everybody they know is judging them, it seems, these days. And so they would talk about that. They talk about it at some length. And they'd go on and on about how they didn't like it when people judged them negatively. Even people they were very close to were trying to get them to stop smoking for good reason. And yet that really wasn't a way for us to talk about mouthwash very much, other than to say, well, you could use this mouthwash and it's going to make your breath feel minty and fresh and all of that. Now, this brand was a small brand. It was competing with Listerine and Scope. And they could make great promises about killing bacteria that causes bad breath, but they weren't targeting smoking. And so we realized that basic interview questions weren't going to get us to where we needed to go. So the technique that was applied was a technique called guided retrospection, which is a kind of storytelling where you have people go back in their lives and they talk about something in their lives, an emotion, an experience that parallels the very thing that you're focusing on. Sometimes people get stuck in a focus group if you say, talk to me about your experiences and your feelings surrounding smoking. And they'll tell you those stories about people judging them, but you don't get that deep. And so we started to talk to people about when they would say, for example, I felt like a pariah. Tell us about some other situations in your life in the past, not involving smoking, where you felt like a pariah. Mm-hmm. And they would say, when I was back in middle school and I did something really stupid, I was so embarrassed, I wish that I could be invisible. And we're listening to people talk about this and talk about how awful they felt. And it was so clear that they just wanted to disappear. A light bulb went off. And the light bulb was, what if this mouthwash was able to, of course it's going to make your breath fresh, but that's not really the promise you want to make. Because again, you won't compete that well with Listerine or Scope. But talk about essentially how you understand or convey how you understand the emotions that smokers have, the desire for invisibility, and then create some advertising that communicated that you could render the smoking invisible to others who you might be intimate with. So we created an advertisement that basically had a man and a woman meeting in a restaurant. They kiss, and the woman leans into the man after kissing him. She leans back for a second and she says, "Did you quit smoking?" He says, "Did I?" And there's a little bit of a flirtation going on, and the commercial goes on to explain how this product worked. And the idea was to say, if you are a smoker, you can do this. But in any case, that's a good example of using storytelling to go deeper when you're really on a surface level.
Mm-hmm. Does another example come to mind where you guided someone through a retrospection and another light bulb went off?
I have a good example, actually, of when you're stuck. Not so much getting stuck in the interview process, but in the process itself.
Okay.
When you do focus groups, what happens is everybody, marketing team, the advertising team, everybody gets together and they say, what do we want to achieve here? The marketing research company develops a guide. Everybody looks at the guide, and then you go off and you do the research. And what I found is that I was working on Simply Orange in Canada with the Coca-Cola company. And they had a lot of ideas and they had a lot of data, but they were trying to figure out a new positioning for the brand. And I thought that a really good way to mix this up would be to change the way that we conducted the research. So I did two things, one of which was not so much a violation of the typical focus group way of working, and the other one was. The first thing I did was say to everybody on the team, I want you to email me your hypotheses about what consumers think about drinking orange juice and about their health, because Simply Orange was really focusing on a health message. And talk about what the benefits of it might be. And I want to see those before we go into the research. And that would also help in formulating the interview guide. So that was good because it made everything that was implicit, or some things that were implicit, explicit. People had accountability for their hypotheses. It was a good way to start it. So that's not a big violation. But the thing that was a bit of a violation was the violation of a norm in the way you conduct focus groups. So what we did was we had a day of groups scheduled. And we had 4 groups. And after the first 2 groups, after we learned quite a bit and we had some responses to these hypotheses and we were generating some ideas with the consumers, we had about an hour and a half of a break. And in that break, we essentially had an ideation workshop. Then we would immediately apply some of those new hypotheses and some of that new thinking into the other 2 groups that were to follow. And it was in a sense a violation of what you usually do, because usually you want the learnings to sit with you for a while after a focus group. But this was a way of turning it around and enabling everyone to come up with ideas that were very different. So we were co-creators in a way with the people in the focus groups after the first 2 sessions. So Simply Orange is a way of accessing one's better self, and the self you want to be. Maybe a way of simplifying your life in a complex culture. Everything around you is swirling around. Maybe this is one thing that is not complex. And also Simply Orange is the one thing that you can do to take care of yourself. It could represent a less stressful life just by its name. And even just the choice of something called Simply Orange could express a kind of personal philosophy of taking the road less traveled. But these ideas were produced in a kind of collaborative effort. And then we had a lot of ideas that were testable. So that was a very effective way of essentially breaking the mold of the way that you conduct research and flipping it a little bit.
Are there other ways you like to break the rules when it comes to research?
Oh, well, I would say that the kind of inherent messiness of ethnography is a kind of breaking of the rules that can be extremely productive.
Let's talk about that for a second. And we were talking the other day, you had mentioned, you use this phrase, the messiness of ethnography. And, I think the last thing that most clients want to hear or invest in is a messy project, right? They want everything buttoned up. So how do you sell an ethnographic project into a client that isn't accustomed to doing that kind of thing?
Ethnography is a hard sell because, per person, it's very expensive. You can get a lot more people in focus groups and a lot more people in some kind of survey or data mining process, very different kind of thing. I think the way of selling it, let's start from that potential attack that it's messy. They don't see it as being as systematic because, you're going off into the field and you don't know what you're going to encounter. What I will say is, ethnography is naturalistic and it's contextual. It's the only kind of research where you get that. It's in real time. If you're talking to people in a focus group, asking people questions in a survey, or even data mining, it's what people may remember in a focus group and in a survey. They may be managing an impression that they want you to have of them, particularly in a focus group or an in-depth interview. So what ethnography does is sidestep all of that. But the other thing is to say that it's messy. It's not conducted in a sloppy or shambolic way. You're not going in there and just going from one thing to the other, bouncing off the walls. You go in with a guide. What the messiness refers to is the unpredictability of the encounter. And a good ethnographer really needs to listen and observe very closely and be open to exploring behavior that they didn't anticipate. Mm-hmm. So when that happens, they may discover something might pop up that wasn't in the guide they didn't think was going to happen. And then they follow that lead rather than follow a rigid agenda like in an interview guide or a survey, and then they can discover something. So I'll give you an example. I know you like examples.
I love examples.
I was conducting an ethnographic interview in the Plaza Hotel. Nice place to do research. And we were trying to figure out what really motivated them and what was it about staying in a luxury hotel that made it worth it. Plaza was a good example. So I'm sitting there doing this interview with someone, and we're sitting in a little cafe that's on the first floor of the Plaza, and we got some coffee there. We're having a good interview. A colleague and mine, we're talking to this person, and we're asking questions about why she likes to stay there and what really motivates her and so on. And then something really interesting happened. I was taking notes with a pen, and my pen either jammed or ran out of ink. I don't know what happened. And someone from the Plaza, it might have been our server, it might have just been someone else, came over and placed a Plaza pen right next to me and walked away.
Wow.
And the person who we were talking to said, when I talk about luxury in a luxury hotel, and I think about the Plaza, that's what I mean. And I asked the typical research question, and you were talking about techniques. One of the great ones is, tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. Or help me understand that. There's a kind of classic open-ended questions, and those are really good because what the person said was, I like the fact that he didn't say to me or say to you, see, your pen ran out of ink, here's a Plaza pen, or interrupt in any way. And it was so subtle. That's what you expect at a place like this. And when we presented to the company and we were talking about the kind of magic, the threshold that you walk over, the magic in the Plaza was partly that. It wasn't somebody coming over and gushing about how I have a pen for you, sir. Here, you can use this, nothing like that. It was very subtle, very sophisticated, and it was emblematic of the way that the Plaza should be and the way that they should train every single one of their staff if they already haven't been doing that. And they said, Plaza people really like this, the marketing people, because they said, we should do more of this. That's part of it. And that's where I think ethnography has enormous value. But I think ultimately what you need to convey if you're trying to sell it is that what you're after always as a market researcher is the difference between what people say they do and what they do, what they say they feel and how they feel. Sometimes they don't even know what their needs are. They don't express them, and you can discover those by being with them. If you want to look at user experience or customer experience, when you do it in real time, as opposed to ask them to describe their experience, it's a world of difference because you're seeing how they navigate a website or an app and you see their frustrations and it becomes more palpable, and that really helps. And so I think ultimately what ethnography does is all of those things, but it's also, because it's so contextual, it affords some lateral vision. You kind of see more around it. Anthropology is essentially a holistic discipline, and ethnography stems from anthropology. So you're seeing more than just the one thing you're looking at. You're seeing it more completely.
And what you're speaking to a lot is this idea of looking for a moment, right? A lot of times when it comes to those breakthrough moments that brands are looking for, it just happens in a turn of phrase, an overlooked data point, a different context. And of course, it's very stressful for researchers and strategists because our job is to create the conditions and ask those insightful questions or notice those moments that reveal themselves, that special something that no one has thought of before. How do you go about getting to those moments so consistently?
Well, I think every market researcher's fear is that they're doing research and the client says, yeah, this is confirming everything we know. And a lot of clients will say that, by the way, in research. But then you want to go from there to, oh, here's something I didn't know. And you hope for that moment. Sometimes it happens after the research. You think about it and you come up with an insight. Sometimes it happens when the research is occurring and you just get lucky. I was working on the WD-40 brand. WD-40 is an industrial lubricant. It's not just used in industry. There's one in almost every house in America. And the WD stands for water displacement. The 40 took them 40 times to get it exactly right. Company's been in business for probably about 75 years. Great product. But they hadn't innovated for about 50 years. And they were selling pretty well, but now they were having a problem. There were some brands, particularly a brand called PB Blaster, that was nipping at its heels, and they didn't like that. So the research that was suggested was some ethnographies, and we were going to couple that with some ideation on new products, because maybe the way of dealing with the marketplace was to create some new products finally at long last after 50 years. We also knew that WD-40 had a bit of a problem, which all of these products, including PB Blaster, had, which is that, it had a detachable straw, this little red plastic straw that if you didn't use it, it would have a wide spray. If you stuck it in the nozzle, it would have a narrow spray. Really good idea, but people would lose the straw. And that could be a problem. So here we are conducting research. I'm there with some people that are going to conduct these ideation sessions. And we're going from one ethnography to the other. We would talk to professionals. So we were talking to someone who was working on some small machinery. And he was repairing something. We had set this up so he would be doing some work during the ethnographies. And he had a can of PB Blaster there. The PB Blaster was, in his hand, and he's using it to spray these parts of the machine that are not working as well, not grinding as smoothly as they should be, working as smoothly as they should be. So I'm looking around the room and, I see in the corner of my eye, there's a can of WD-40 about 10 feet away. And that was fortunate that it was actually within, that I could see it, because if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have been able to ask him a particular question. So I said to him, how do you like PB Blaster? What's your favorite thing about it? All the usual questions. Do you use any other products? And he said, oh, yeah, sometimes I use WD-40. And he points to the place where the WD-40 is. So it's about 10 steps away. And I'm thinking, why isn't it worth walking 10 steps to get it? I mean, it's WD-40. It's an iconic brand. Now, of course, I couldn't lead him that way into a question. I just said to him, so why did you decide to use the PB Blaster instead of the WD-40? And he said, well, the PB Blaster was right here. Now, that seems like a really reasonable answer. But the light bulb, when I talk about light bulbs going off, the light bulb that went off on my head was we had a value problem. WD-40 wasn't worth walking 10 steps for. We thought we had an iconic brand. My client thought they had an iconic brand, and they did it, but it still didn't have that added value. And so the discussion that we had with the company was, that they've been working on trying to create a straw that was attached mechanically to the top of the WD-40. But they hadn't launched it because they were a little afraid of messing with this iconic brand. They didn't want to change it. It would look different if it had a different top. They thought they might lose people. And plus, they would have to raise the price. But we convinced the CEO of the company that you should move forward with this. So we did a lot more research on it. We did some concept use tests. We did a lot of other kind of standard market research on this. And Smart Straw, which is what the product was, it became, that was the name of it, was tested at being $1 more. And it entered the marketplace a number of years ago. And it has been an incredible success. And since then, WD-40 has had a number of other kinds of innovations with the straw itself, with curly straws and so on, so it can get into little places. But the moment, that key moment in the ethnography was an incredible moment of just thinking, oh my goodness, this is the problem. The problem isn't this guy just using what's convenient. He's not using WD-40 because he doesn't think it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, that interchangeability problem, it's a client's worst nightmare, right? Which is, I use this one if it's nearby. I use that one if it's nearby. And you're like, no, you have to use our stuff, don't you? And when we were talking the other day, you mentioned another technique for getting closer to those aha moments. It's called laddering. Can you tell me what that's about?
Oh, sure. So laddering has been around at least since the 1960s. I always say to my students, it's kind of an annoying battery of questions. Because I might say to you, how do you feel when you have a cold? And you would say, I don't know, I just feel listless. So the laddering technique would be, how does that make you feel? And you would say, when I feel listless, I feel helpless. And how does that make you feel? There are parodies of this, in psychology. You see these things, and the psychologist asking these questions, how does that make you feel? The patient wants to punch the psychologist in the nose. So when you're a marketing researcher, you have to do it with a little bit of a twinkle in your eye. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and please forgive me for being obnoxious. But ultimately, you can get to what people in advertising would often call an end-to-end benefit or a higher order benefit. Laddering is one of these things where your head can explode because it's going deeper, but you're also laddering up. So I don't know which it is. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is find the underlying meaning of a thing, the underlying sentiment. Because ultimately what you might get to, and I worked on a lot of OTCs, is that people, when they were sick, felt that they couldn't be in the world. And so what you would want to do is, and you see this in a lot of OTC advertising for whether it's a headache remedy or often a cold remedy, where they would feel listless and maybe isolated, they'd be shown by themselves. But then after they've used this product, they'd be out in the world interacting people. And it wasn't just because they were feeling better, because the underlying emotion was they could be out there. They could live their lives. And that could be the ultimate reward. That's what really makes them feel like a well person. That's one way of using laddering. It's a very effective technique.
Yeah, whether you're laddering up or you're digging down, I often talk about going deeper and digging down to find that insight, to find that gem. And you mentioned students, and I found that when younger strategists are doing research, they'll often just accept the first answer that's given to them without a lot of follow-up. So, you ask a question, well, I feel listless when I don't feel well. Okay, great. Next question. But, to get to somewhere new, you have to dig deeper. And there's almost an improv-like quality to the job, right? Because you can keep asking, how does that make you feel? Or you could ask them why, 5 times deep. But you can also ask it from a slightly different angle. Are there certain other questions or follow-up questions that you like to ask in situations like that where, okay, I'm not going to just keep burrowing straight down. I'm going to approach this from a slightly different angle?
Yeah, there are so many because, you can do something like word association. When you think of a restaurant, what do you think of? And then they start listing all these different associations with a restaurant, and you can create You can get kind of the nomenclature of the restaurant experience. And then you can dig down into each one. Tell me more about what it's like when you walk into a crowded restaurant and how that makes you feel, or a noisy one. You can go to all these different places. I think it's really good.
Now, you've done some very interesting research in the pet food category for a brand called Freshpet.
Yeah.
What did the client come to you with in terms of their primary concern or their research goal?
Freshpet's a really interesting company. They create mostly refrigerated fresh products. They have an expiration date. They're kept in the refrigerator. Some of them look a little like a pepperoni. Some of them are in bags. It's a relatively small business compared with the really big players on the market, but they have a good business and they've shown some really nice growth. And what they wanted to do was deepen their relationship with their current users and also some people that weren't aware of it at all. And they wanted to know what they could do to brand Freshpet in a more powerful way, ultimately to create better advertising for it. What happened was a really interesting project because the person that contacted my company, we had worked with on Post Foods, Post Cereal, and now she was working for Freshpet as one of their insight directors. But she said, look, what I want you to do is do not exactly a mixed method. You're going to mix it at the end, but at first what I want you to do is do some psychologically oriented focus groups. So they had my partner Cynthia basically engineer that. And Cynthia is a brilliant consumer psychologist. She's able to listen very closely to focus groups in the back room and really come up with really novel ideas. And then I was charged with leading anthropologically oriented ethnographies. And we were basically sequestered from one another. In other words, the client said, look, Cynthia, don't you even look at what Bob is doing on the ethnographies. Bob, don't look at what Cynthia is doing on the focus groups. In the end, you'll create an integrated report. The quick thing that I'll tell you about the psychological part of it was that my partner came up with a really interesting approach using the concept of cognitive dissonance. That is that people love their pets. And if they're feeding them and they think of them as members of their families, and if they come up with anything less satisfying to their pets, who they anthropomorphize, they want them to feel happy about what they're eating, they could feel guilty about that. So what Freshpet does is resolve the cognitive dissonance of not maybe having your pet enjoy the best meal by providing this wonderful experience because it's refrigerated and it's Freshpet. It tastes really great. You can see all the vegetables in there and so on. So she had a really great approach. I didn't know about that. I was doing ethnographies. So I went to people's homes, went shopping with them. The client was with me. I went to all of them. I was watching them interact with their pets, where the pets play, where they sleep, all of that. But at one point I said, I see that you feed your dog food out of a bag that's dry and food out of a can. And my client, I knew, thought of the category as a kind of binary. There's wet food and there's dry food. And they weren't quite sure where Freshpet fit. So I asked the respondents in their kitchens at their kitchen table with the refrigerator right next to them where many of them kept Freshpet. And I said, show me on a continuum where these fall. And I said, some of you have talked about cooking food on your own, home cooked food. Where does that fall? And then they said, well, that's really close to the canned food, but it's even better. All right, so now show me, on this flat table, their kitchen table, where you might put Freshpet. And they put Freshpet between the canned food and the home cooked food. And then I asked them why, and we explored that. And a lot of that had to do with just the fact that it was in the refrigerator. It seemed fresher to them for sure. Those who fed their dogs Freshpet saw how the dogs loved it even more than any other food. They'd often mix it with other foods, and the dogs really would eat the Freshpet first. So that's a good finding, solid finding. Does that have the wings that you really need? So I go back to the office. I'm writing up the research report. And I'm thinking about the way the client has defined the category in terms of a binary opposition. There's wet food and there's dry food. They're not sure where Freshpet should fit. So my first conclusion is, well, Freshpet, is in between wet food and dry food. But then I take this horizontal line with a range of dry food to canned food to Freshpet to home cooked food, and I turn it into a vertical line. So now it's a hierarchy. So I'm thinking it's a hierarchy where the least attractive food for the customer could be dry food, and the least appealing to the dog is dry food. The next would be the canned food. And Freshpet could be next because it's close to home cooked food, which they're not going to cook for their dog all the time. And then I had this little, it was like a spark of insight where I thought, all my clients have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of need. So I thought, well, this is not a hierarchy of need, but what if I were to make a pun out of it and I were to call it the hierarchy of feed? That would be some good theater for a presentation. So I created this vertical, and the headline was that the positioning for the brand should be based on the hierarchy of feed. And the way of thinking about the Freshpet to the client, the positioning should be, it's not wet food or dry food, it's Freshpet. So separating the brand from the category. So now the category is not a binary anymore. You're encouraging the consumer to think about it differently. Distinguish Freshpet by actually making it a distinctive thing. It's not like the other things. That was the insight. The meeting went sensationally well. The client loved it. When I wrote all this up, I didn't see anything yet in the marketplace about it. So one day I'm teaching it in class, and I said, I don't know if they ever really used it. They seem to like it. And I wasn't even sure if they used the psychological approach that my partner came up with or mine. It turned out a student raised her hand, and she was going online while I was talking about this, and she found that they were actually using it in their advertising, and they still are. But of course, because they had a creative team working on it, they were not going to use my line. It's not wet food or dry food, it's Freshpet, because that's a positioning. That's not really a creative line. It could be, I guess. But they came up with something better. Their selling line is, it's not dog food, it's food. Mm. So it was a really great example. And they've been airing this advertising for a few years, and it's still on. They're creating new executions of it all the time. So they must like it a lot.
Well, I love that example because it also shows the somersault between the strategic what and the creative how, right? So it went from this well-articulated strategy or strategic positioning that you mentioned, but then they transformed it just a little bit creatively to say it's not dog food, it's food.
Right.
Do you think that you could have gotten there if it weren't for the in-person element?
It's a very good question. First of all, you wouldn't have gotten there in a survey. Could you have gotten there in a focus group? It's conceivable, but I have to tell you that sitting in people's kitchens, next to their refrigerators, next to where they feed their dogs, having a kind of casual conversation with them, which is how a lot of ethnography unfolds. I do have a guide, but, as I said before, I'm following leads and I'm asking these different questions. I'm watching them prepare it, by the way, and I have somebody who's taking video of it and all of that. The very fact of sitting at the kitchen table right next to where they would cook home cooked food and where they would serve it and prepare it and all that, I think it stimulated the conversation in a better way. And I think it had just greater emotional heft than it would have had otherwise. The idea of the hierarchy of feed was just, as I said, a kind of a piece of theater.
Well, presentation is extremely important. I love that you call it presentation theater because there are theatrical moments. There's the pregnant pause that can also help in research. Do you think that AI or AI ethnographies are as effective at getting to those aha moments?
Well, some people are scared of it. I actually embrace AI. I started embracing AI from pretty much the moment it was introduced a few Novembers ago. First of all, I want to say this. AI is not a substitute for our work. It's a collaborator. Sometimes it's a research assistant. We all know it sometimes hallucinates. I think with AI, there are a lot of ways of using it. AI can be really good at helping you formulate research problems. It can help you design an interview guide. Think of things that you might miss. It can help do thematic analysis of findings in much less time than you might otherwise produce. It can help with ideation. It can come up with really good new product ideas and marketing tactics. But the thing is that all of us who are in this business, and I mean, the insight business, essentially know that we are unique unto ourselves. That is, you're different from I am. Your experiences are different. Your training is different. Whether or not you have a PhD in anthropology or you studied English or physics in college, those things all formulate the person that is coming to the research and conducting it. And AI has a lot of knowledge and can draw on all of these things. But, the you that's you, to borrow a line from the TV show Severance, I don't know if your listeners will know that show.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
That distinctiveness really adds a lot to research. And I think that ultimately, maybe someday AI will be able to tap into that. I think we're a long way from being able to duplicate what we do as researchers in terms of the way we listen to, notice things. I don't think AI is necessarily going to notice something like I did with WD-40. It might, but I don't know if it would. Synthetic respondents are something else. I was listening to a seminar the other day on synthetic respondents, and the person said, well, why don't you just ask AI? You don't need to do it. Just ask AI the question. One thing you can do is create personas and then ask AI how they might respond to a particular question. I still think that the interaction between the moderator or the ethnographer and the person that you're speaking with has an enormous amount of energy. I'm not a Luddite by any means. I use AI every day, but I think we have to be careful about relying on it too much and leaving out the human being, at least for now.
Is there a particular prompt you almost always like to use at the beginning of a project?
No, because there's this term prompt engineering. And what I find is that the kind of generic prompts aren't very good. I remember I asked AI just for fun how to achieve world peace. It wasn't very good. I mean, it just said everybody should basically come together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. You need to be very specific with AI. In some ways, it's not very bright, even though it's artificial intelligence. It knows a lot, but it needs really good direction. So it's learning from me just as I'm learning from it. And then it's refining whatever it's doing. So I think you have to really think hard about what it is you're after and know that you're probably going to need a couple of tries to get to a response that's going to be helpful.
All right, we've come to the speed round, Bob. All right.
Okay.
All right, so here we go. What's your favorite word in English or any other language?
I'm going to give you a word and a couple of phrases in 3 different languages. Okay. So it's a little bit of a cheat.
That's okay.
I would say that in English, my favorite word is kindness, because if we can do that, we're going to be in really good shape. There is a phrase in Tagalog, which is a Philippine language. That's where I did my fieldwork when I was working on my doctorate. And the phrase is utang na loob. It is a debt from within inside yourself. It's a debt that can never be repaid. So children owe that to their parents. If I saved your life, you would have that debt to me. But it's also about the exchange from one person to the other that builds relationship. The gifting is constantly unfolding and multiplying in a good relationship. And so I've always loved that phrase, and there's a kind of poetry to it. Mm-hmm. Another phrase that I like a lot is tikkun olam, which is a Hebrew word. I don't speak Hebrew, but I learned this a long time ago. It means repairing the world. And it relates to kindness, and actually kind of relates to utang na loob, in that if we can all work a little bit towards repairing the world every day, we'll be living in a better world. I don't know that we're going to solve everything, but we're going to be improving.
It reminds me of kintsugi from Japanese pottery, where, when something breaks, you actually repair it with gold. And that repairing, you're not meant to try to hide the fact that it was broken or that it cracked. It makes it more beautiful in its imperfection. It's a beautiful concept. What's a subject that you recently got super interested in and just went down the rabbit hole on it because of insatiable curiosity?
The subject that first got me interested in high school was anthropology, and I went down that rabbit hole for years. But I would say that AI has been the rabbit hole that I've been down. I can't say I'm an expert on it, but as I said, I use it every day for something. At first, I thought, this could be good for marketing research, and then I found it could be good for just about everything. I understand the fears that people have of it, not only in terms of destroying the world, but maybe making us a little lax. I don't know what will become of the world using it. I suspect that it's certainly in health and wellness, we could become much better off. But in global interaction, I'm not so sure yet. So, and in marketing research, it's certainly a great tool. I think some people might lean too heavily into it. And if they do that, that could be a problem. But as we've been talking, if the humans and AI can collaborate effectively, I think we're both going to get along better.
Yeah, I've been creating my own chat GPTs. I have a strategy assistant chat GPT. I have a home chef chat GPT that I converse with about recipes and what I can do with what's inside my fridge or pantry at any given time. There are countless ways to use it. It's a fascinating tool for sure. Is there another brand, or is there a brand out there whose work you really admire, or that you think to yourself, I wish I'd come up with that idea?
I'm going to talk to you about an idea for product use, not so much a brand. And this relates to repairing the world. And this is something that I use in teaching. A few years ago in Ghana, there was a big problem that parents, mothers and fathers, but particularly mothers, would touch things, might be dirty things, manure, whatever it might be. And they go into the bathroom, rinse their hands, walk out, and prepare food. And there was some interest in the medical community to try to address this and say, look, you should be using soap. And there weren't enough people that were using soap. The problem was that they didn't really see the need for using soap. They thought washing their hands with just plain water was enough. So the first thing, this is why I love this, the first thing that all the people in medicine wanted to convince people of was that there's something called germs. The water's not going to get rid of the germs. You need soap to get rid of the germs. And as one doctor said, we could talk about germs until we were blue in the face, but it didn't change behavior because it wasn't something that resonated within the culture of the people that they were talking to, partly because they didn't see the problems that the germs were causing as anything other than normal growing up. So, for example, their kids got diarrhea and they thought our kids getting diarrhea is normal. So we don't care about any of that stuff. So the only reason they used the water was to kind of get the dirt off their hands, but not the germs. And that's why the soap wasn't doing very well. But what they found in research, the more they talked to people, was that they did find certain types of things on their hands disgusting. And disgust was what motivated them. And so the answer was to create some messaging that literally showed with these kind of hokey superimpositions of different colors, that after the mom of these little children that she's cooking for goes into the bathroom, she rinses her hands, or maybe she doesn't rinse her hands in some cases, walks out and everything's still on her hands. These germs are still floating around her hands, but they look disgusting. So it's not the germs they're talking about. It's just the look. They were making the invisible visible. That was really critical. That's something, it's kind of a motif that sometimes you find in marketing. Well, in this case, it was also true, by the way, with Freshpet, making a refrigerator in a store that people might walk by that might be invisible to them, more visible by talking about the virtues of Freshpet. In this case, what you're doing is you're talking about showing them that there's something on their hands that they're not seeing that is not good, that's disgusting. And they created advertising, and enough people saw it where it increased hand washing, diarrhea and other illnesses, all of that decreased. And so it was considered a success. And so, the reason I like it so much is because they focused on what mattered to people in Ghana, not what mattered to doctors. They were considering the local culture and psychology, not something called germ science, which was meaningless to them. And so it's a theme in marketing research. Always start with the customer. Get into the heads of the people that you need to understand, rather than in a conference room, divide the category a certain way, or like with a doctor, I've got to get them to understand germs. They need to understand germs. No, they don't. They don't need to know a thing about germs. What they need to understand is, maybe it's not even an understanding, what they need to feel is that there's something disgusting that they don't want on their hands, even if they can't see it.
Oh, it's a great example. What's one of the most interesting jobs you had before you got into the work you do that has helped you do your job better?
I played in rock bands a lot of my life. And being in a rock band is kind of interesting because I'm a guitar player. So in a rock band, one thing, if you're a lead guitar player, you need to be able to shine, stand in the spotlight. But you also need to be a team player. You have to be able to know when to back people. And that includes every aspect of playing in a band, or else you're not going to be in the band very long. But another thing that I think a rock band taught me is that you can be disciplined and creative, and you can incorporate improvisation into the most structured thing. A parallel for me is take something like blues, 12-bar, 1-4-5 rock and roll based blues progressions, blues, rock, very close. But within a very structured 12-bar composition with only 3 chords and a simple beat, a guitarist, a pianist, anybody can improvise to the sky. And rock taught me that that kind of structure is a good foundation. So when you're doing marketing research, you want a structure. So you need a guide. You need to get the right respondents. You got to make sure that, you're on target in terms of what you want to focus on in the research, but then be prepared to improvise. When you can do that, you can come up with something and then really be able to riff off of it the way, a good guitar player would. And then also, as Dylan might say, bring it all back home.
What's a piece of advice that you got early on in your life or in your career that you still remember to this day or that you think of often?
I learned this in advertising. I think it's very good in any kind of commercial relationship. I think it's also good if you're meeting a friend for coffee. And the phrase was always bring something new. When I was going to meet with a client, I needed to bring them a new idea, a fresh idea. I'm not talking about a creative idea necessarily, a different way of thinking about their business, or maybe something that I read about that morning in the newspaper. And this speaks to the relationship, to go back to the beginning of this conversation, between findings and insights. Not just report on what I read, that's the finding, but talk about the insight. What did I glean from it that could help them in their marketing? And if I bring that to them, they're going to say, this guy is worth working with. And so that to me is something that I think it served me very well in business, certainly in my career, and sometimes even in casual conversations with people.
Always bring something new. You have brought so many new ideas through this conversation. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be here today and for sharing your time with me.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to do it. You asked me some good questions, some that got me thinking, and that's always good.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bob. Appreciate it. Thanks again to our guest, Bob Morais from Columbia University. If you want to connect with Bob, you can find him on LinkedIn, or check out some of his books like Advertising and Anthropology, Ethnographic Practice and Cultural Perspectives, or check out The Language of Branding, Theories, Strategies, and Tactics. They're full of fascinating examples. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform, or share it with colleagues and clients and say, you see, this is what I'm talking about. If you can't get enough of these ethnographic techniques, check out some of our previous episodes, including my conversation with Tim Malafite, who has done some fascinating research on the surprisingly social nature of driving and how that impacts the development of self-driving cars. If you're looking for even more ideas and aha moments, head over to chriskochek.com. There you can find some of my newest online courses, case studies, and creative exercises for building insights and breakthrough ideas. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe to the Lightbulb newsletter. Every Thursday, I share 3 aha moments that are guaranteed to inspire your next project, creative briefing, or campaign. Special thanks to Michael Osborne at 14th Street Studios for producing this episode, and thank you to Megan Palmer for additional editing and production support. Until next time, keep looking for patterns, finding contradictions, and asking, what if, more often.